This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from Ho Chi Minh City. Longtime newsletter readers know that I have a keen interest in Vietnam's energy sector. From the growth of renewables and the Just Energy Transition Partnership to Prime Minister Pham Minh Chin's commitment to go net zero by 2050, and last year's serious power shortages up north, there's no shortage of topics here. Energy is without a doubt one of the most important issues facing Vietnam, and every country for that matter, as it intersects with climate change, economic growth, foreign investment, environmental protection, and daily life for everyone here, among other issues. Vietnam has been on something of a roller coaster in this area over the last 5 years, going from a renewable darling lauded for its net zero commitment to a country facing long delays on absolutely vital energy policies, coupled with a very real threat of large-scale power outages. And in an effort to reduce that threat, short-term fixes are further damaging what was once an enviable reputation. Reuters reported last week that Vietnam's coal imports have doubled this year over the same period in 2023, indicating that the nation's coal fleet will be called on to work overtime in the case of shortages. At the same time, it's worth noting that the Prime Minister recently told a meeting of foreign investors that, in fact, there will be no shortages this year. All of these issues are intertwined and deeply complex. And like the Mekong discussed a couple of weeks ago here, energy is a topic I plan to return to multiple times on the show in the future. To unpack one angle of the story, today's guest is Trang Nguyen, Southeast Asia lead at the Climate Works Center in Melbourne, Australia. Her background as an economist spans the public, private, and development sectors, including the UK and Vietnam, KPMG, and GIZ, giving her unique insight into energy investment and financing. We discussed the opportunities and challenges of Vietnam's net zero commitment, the Just Energy Transition Partnership and its potential role in catalyzing clean energy financing, the importance of project bankability and currency-based investment risks, and the prospect of Vietnam becoming a clean energy manufacturing hub. This was Trang's first ever podcast appearance, but you wouldn't know it. The financial side of energy is far from my strong suit, and I found Trang's analysis to be highly educational. Let's get to our conversation. Trang, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure.
Yeah, so I just wanted to start off, if you wanted to tell listeners how you came to work in climate policy and how you got to your current role.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the South Asia lead for Climate Work Center, and this is a independent climate change nonprofit organization under Monash University with 15 years of experience working on supporting decarbonization in Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Why I came to work on climate policy, I think professionally and personally, I may, less professionally, I'm a development economist by background, so I do watch a lot of progress on the sustainable solution development goals. And although it's really good to see a lot of progress across all SDGs in many years so far, I think unfortunately climate change, climate action, which is the SDG 13, is the only one that fall backward according to a report by UN published last year. So that's the only goals that didn't make much progress. So I think that's where I really want to contribute more in that space. Personally, I would say I really enjoy the nature of interdisciplinary of climate policies. I mean, a lot of people would think that anyone work on climate policy would be an environmentalist, which is not the case. Like you can be a diplomat, you still work on climate change, you're an investor, you still need to know a lot about climate policies. You're an economist, you still need to do modeling, taking into account what carbon budget looks like, etc., etc. So I like the idea of bringing a lot of people working in different sectors together and discuss the change solutions. So that's really fascinating me in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose climate change is kind of the overarching issue for everybody, no matter wherever you are in the world, no matter what you do. So that makes a lot of sense. And just also kind of briefly, what is the Climate Works Center and what does the center do?
Yeah, so it's a Climate Work Center. It's a climate change think tank under Monash University. It's co-founded by both Monash University in Australia and the My Foundation. we work very closely with different stakeholders in Australia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Island to support them in policies bridging the gap between research and climate actions, and with the goal of accelerate decarbonization at scale. So that's our key mission.
Okay. And now I know your work goes well beyond Vietnam. That's not your only, not the only country you focus on, but of course this is a Vietnam-based podcast, and you are also Vietnamese. And certainly there's plenty to talk about when it comes to climate and decarbonization and all of that within Vietnam. So I guess, I mean, of course, it's been talked about for years here, but perhaps the Prime Minister's pledge to go net zero by 2050 could perhaps be seen as sort of a jumping off point for like really taking this seriously from a high level. So you were in Vietnam when Chin made that announcement. I guess, first of all, could you maybe explain briefly what net zero means? And then also, what did that mean to you as somebody from Vietnam?
Sure. So, I mean, well, you are right. I work beyond Vietnam now, but again, it's a country that is really close to my heart, and I still follow the policies and development in Vietnam very closely, even I'm now based in Melbourne. But at that time when Vietnam Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh announced a net zero by 2050 commitment, I actually was in Vietnam at that time. I was working for the UK government, for British Embassy in Hanoi, and it was a really welcome commitment. It's to me, it's again professionally and personally as well. I would say at that time, seeing Vietnam among 74 other countries committing to a net zero target, it's something that I really want to celebrate as someone working for the UK government as the host of COP26, but also like for someone as a Vietnamese, seeing Vietnam making that big commitment on the international stage. It's really welcome to a Vietnamese citizen, to me as well. And a lot of people would see it as, okay, net zero emission and net zero commitment. It's like basically by 2050, total sum of emission in Vietnam will be no emission. And seeing that commitment, a lot of people will say that, well, it is too much of an ambition for Vietnam. And it's the same for a lot of other countries here in Australia as well. Like people still doubt about that commitment. I do see it more from the finance and investment side. I think target setting is very important to attract investment, especially foreign investment. If I am an investor in renewable, for example, I wouldn't invest if I don't see a sort of policy signal saying that in the next couple of years, we will try to phase out coal and then open the market for renewable. So I think the net zero commitments should be celebrated in the way that, well, it's create a really good signal for the market, for foreign investor to invest in Vietnam, which is very important for the country economic development. I have watched Vietnam economic growth for many years, and it's realized a lot on foreign investment. So it's in twofold. One is can attract international public investment, which we see after that the announcement of the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But then at the same time, it can create a really good momentum to enable private investment into the country as well. So that's how I see the net zero commitments and net zero targets and the importance of it.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that it is ambitious. Maybe some would say impossible, but there's no harm in announcing it, as you say, and it sends a good signal. I mean, some of what you just mentioned we'll get to. I mean, the energy transition, every country is grappling with this, depending on the country, how to phase out coal or what have you, move away from fossil fuels. What do you think Vietnam's biggest challenges in the transition are? And conversely, what are its biggest opportunities?
Maybe let me talk about opportunity first, because it's always good to start with a positive note. I think, as I said before, there's a lot of opportunity to enable foreign investment into the country. Vietnam, it has always been a highly export-oriented country, so which is provides a really good basis for the investment to clean energy, foreign direct investment. And the current trend for foreign investment is not really just within the energy sector. We see a lot of non-energy sector foreign investment firms invest in renewable energies through what we call the commercial and industrial renewable capacity. And there's a lot of attraction to that in Vietnam at the moment. The second opportunity is around the renewable energy manufacturing sectors. Climate Work Central just issued a report called the Supply Chain of Decarbonization Technologies, which really highlight the potential for Vietnam to be a renewable technology manufacturing hub in the region. So at the moment, a lot of renewable energy technology like solar PV batteries, offshore wind supply chains are very highly concentrated in certain countries, for example, China, and for some extent, the EU and the US. So as the world wants to accelerate the energy transition, I think that they need to find a way to diversify the supply chain and the manufacturing of renewable energy technology. So Vietnam has a really good opportunities to make that as a competitive advantage for the country. We are a manufacturing country. We are part of the a lot of global trade agreements and then regional trade agreements, which makes it a really good place for supporting the market and also the trading, regional trading as well. So yeah, I think it is a second opportunity. And then the third one, it's around the clean supply chain. So for example, there is a report by the IEEFA estimate that the global corporates that are investing in Vietnam having the net zero commitments are responsible to around 150 billion of Vietnamese export revenue. So basically, these companies mostly are multilaterals, like for example, the Nike or Apple. They all make their commitments to targeting 100% renewable at some point within this decade. So there's so much opportunities for Vietnam to make it as a competitive advantage to attract foreign investment and maintain that foreign investment favorable destination position in the next couple of years. So talking about the challenges, I would say part of the biggest thing around energy transition is coal phase out. And the problem is that Vietnam coal power fleets are very young. I think youngest in South Asia, 82% of the coal power fleets in Vietnam are less than 10 years old. So the contractual lock-in makes it very difficult to phase out coal. A lot of people highlight around the challenge of the transmission. And it's not unique to Vietnam. It's everywhere, including in Australia as well. And then the financing part, which it's very typical to the context of lower middle income country, how to actually mobilize enough finance for the energy transition is one of the critical challenge for countries like Vietnam.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topic of finance, you already mentioned a few minutes ago the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP, which we like to discuss for a little bit. That was a big deal when it was announced. I forget when it was announced, but anyway, this $15.5 billion deal between Vietnam and the Group of Seven. Now, for context, $15.5 billion. I think it's mostly would be loans, but that's it's kind of a fraction of what Vietnam needs. I mean, I think the World Bank has estimated something like 360 billion is needed by 2040 to keep the transition on pace. But anyway, that's still a significant amount of money. But what is JETP, and why is it important to Vietnam, or what is its importance?
So you're right. I mean, it's the current commitment that the JETP offers is just a small fraction of the total sum of what required for the whole energy transition. But I think it's important to remind everyone that, well, JETP is not designed to actually pay or to cover for the wholesale transition.
Yeah.
It's actually designed to catalyze private financing at scale to support the energy transition. And to that idea, and I know JETP is no way near perfect. There's a lot of things need to work on, but I think it's very important, and I do find it innovative in three folds. I think the first thing is that for the first time, it's represent a partnership between G7 country and Vietnam, or like other countries like South Africa and Indonesia to work together to support the energy transition at scale. So I think that's partnership. It's very important. It includes either not just European countries, but also the US, Japan, who traditionally very favorable in terms of financing fossil fuel in South Asia. So catalyzing that partnership within G7 and also working together with other countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, I think it's a really good way to structure the governance of the energy transition. I think the second thing is around the idea of using public finance to leverage private sector financing. It's something we should recognize, because in no way public finance will be able to facilitate and cover for the whole transition. It requires private finance to actually to be there and to make it work. So to that extent, I think the idea of JETP, it's really innovative in that way. And then the third one is around embedding the trust part into the net zero governance. So when we talk about the context of energy transition, we shouldn't forget the other part of the energy transition, which is like how to actually making sure that the people who all part of the economy benefit from the energy transition. So I think to that, taking into consideration the trust part of the energy transition to JETP, it's a really something we should celebrate. So I think it still needs a lot of work to make it right, but I think the idea should be celebrated. I think we should try to make it work with some initial success in order to create momentum.
And last year, you and your colleagues at ClimateWorks published a report called Building Blocks for Successful JETPs, Indonesia and Vietnam. So you mentioned that Indonesia already, but Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Africa are the three countries to have signed JETP agreements so far. Of course, Vietnam and Indonesia are in the same region, face some of similar challenges and opportunities, I suppose. But that report kind of highlighted success criteria across four benchmarks of systemic, finance, governance, and socioeconomic, which kind of drives home your point about needing stakeholders across different sectors and the importance of the just part. How important are each of these benchmarks? Again, systemic, finance, governance, and socioeconomic.
Yeah, sure. So I think when we talk about the energy transition, the context is very important. In academic literature, they talk about place-based transition, like bringing in the country context, the regional context, the context in the place to the energy transition. So if the country's GDP per capita is less than $5,000 per year, the energy transition should happen in a very different way to the countries that have GDP per capita, like let's say $50,000 per year. So it needs to take into consideration other benchmark. So that's why we created that knowledge product, hopefully trying to bring together some of the policy consideration and tools across different other elements of the energy transition. So of course, everyone will work towards together what we call systemic benchmark, which is making sure that accelerate the coal phase out, increase the renewable energy uptakes. But then we also need to take into consideration other part, like for example, financing, how we can create an enable policy environment to attract private investment into the market, which is a very important element of the energy transition, how we can get investor to actually take into consideration of the trust element when they make decision on investing in their portfolio. It's another element and example of the financing benchmark. We talk about governance. So governance is so important for the energy transition because, as said at the beginning, it's not just in one sector. It needs to be interdisciplinary area of work, and it requires a lot of involvement of different part of the societies. It requires different stakeholders, different ministries. It requires the involvement of non-state actors as well, and the industry and the corporates. So making the governance right is very important. And then the last piece, which is so important for countries like Vietnam, is around the social economic outcomes. Like, for example, how we can make sure that codependent regions and provinces, like, for example, Quảng Ninh province, can actually successfully economically transit as they phase out coal. It's one piece of the puzzle. And then what are the how the story around the upskilling and reskilling the labor force is also very important. How we can make sure that women and girls are also benefit from the energy transition and the all the upskilling and reskilling program. So there are different aspects of the energy transition that we need to take into consideration to actually to make it work. So that's the whole piece of the paper, hopefully lay out.
Yeah, which once again just highlights how multidimensional all of this is and difficult, of course. But also from that report, I mean, you have an economics background and kind of highlighted how it also mentions the gap. This is in both Indonesia and Vietnam, I suppose, but a quote, or a gap of a robust pipeline of bankable projects. So, I mean, we're discussing Vietnam, but what does that mean? What is a bankable project, and why is this pipeline important?
Yeah, so I think bankable it's a very private sector terms. Like basically, investor and companies would
Mm.
invest in a project if they are not bankable. It's a very market economy driven process. So there's so many elements that make a project bankable, but I think it's sometimes it's around the enabling policies in order to make sure investors are really confident to invest in the market. Sometimes it's around things like, for example, our report on, we also just issued another report called Enabling Investment for Vietnam Energy
Mm.
Transition. And one of the things we find out is actually, for example, the cost of capital for projects in Vietnam Dong is actually much higher than the cost of capital for a project in Vietnam in USD.
Mm.
So there is a sort of currency rates element there that actually need to be addressed. And that's something that public financing can actually really help in that case. And in some of the example best practice in the world, that's where public financing come in to reduce that currency risks in order to make the project more bankable and more less risky for the investor. Some other elements, for example, like at the moment, we find out that there are a lot of existing pipeline and investor to renewable energy projects in Vietnam are concentrated in around the group of investors in South Asia and East Asia who are very familiar to Vietnamese
Mm.
market. For example, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, and Japan. These are traditional investors for Vietnam. So I think one of the key elements of bankable projects is also rely on the familiarity of the investor to the market and to the institutional context of the country as well. So that's why we are trying to do some of the work, trying to bringing more investors from Australia to Vietnam by connecting them with the opportunities and the understanding of the market and the business here, so that they can get more familiarized with the context, so that they get more confident in, and that also sometimes make the project much more bankable in the way that it reduces the perceived risks from the investor about the market.
Could we go back to that currency risk for a second? I hadn't really heard that before. I'm also not like a finance economics guy. So what creates that? Why is something more expensive in dong than dollars?
So basically, when we talk about currency risk, so if I, because of the fluctuation of the currency in the market, I think USD has always been a sort of safe
Mhm.
currency for all the investor. Whereas for Vietnam Dong, there is certain things around the macroeconomics and the monetary policies that could impact upon the evaluation of the Vietnam Dong in the market. So, for example, if for a project for 10 years, for example, to deploy a renewable project in Vietnam, investor need to calculate like in 10 years time, what is the cash flow would look like in USD, in original currency, but also in Vietnam Dong. So when they convert from USD to Vietnam dong, all the currency rates, if investor, they need to take into account the fluctuations of the currency. So I think there's a certain element around that rates that investor need to take into account that makes it very, and one part of that is the convertibility of the Vietnam dong is still very low. So although the monetary policy has been quite stable in the last couple of years, I think the investors still find it and still need to take into account quite a bit of risk premium when they calculate the cost for the project.
Okay. And you mentioned policy, public financing, public policies, those sorts of things. So what do you think are the most important policy steps Vietnam could take, or maybe should take, to sort of continue to catalyze this transition and make sure it takes hold? I know there's Power Development Plan 8, for example, which was approved last year, although my understanding is the implementation plan is still being discussed, which I think is a bit of an issue for foreign investors. But anyway, beyond PDPA, what would you sort of like to see happen?
You're right, Michael. I think one of the key things is around consistency of policy. I think it's very important to signal for the investor in the market. So it's good that Vietnam issued that plan. I think the implementation plan needs to go live soon and needs to be provide a consistent message for the investor and to make sure that they can be confident to invest in the market. I think a lot of discussion around the solution for transmission and storage, and that requires a lot of investment as well, especially public investment. And I think that's where initiatives like JETP or other multilateral funding could really come in and help to sort of making sure that the transmission and the storage part of the energy transition would be able to enable more renewable energy uptake. And then I think the third one is around the electricity market reform. I know that Vietnam has a lot planned at the moment for electricity market reform, but I think it's important to make sure that the economic efficiency and the reliability of electricity markets it's very important when we think about as a fundamental to making sure that the energy transition can actually take place. So that's some technical part of the energy transition that I think it's important to be addressed.
Okay. And kind of within that, maybe specifically looking at renewables, I guess, especially solar and wind, particularly through 2018, 2019, Vietnam had this sort of explosion, especially of solar development, kind of rapidly becoming the leader in solar capacity in Southeast Asia. Now, important caveat, capacity doesn't mean all of that is actually being generated and transmitted. Again, that's not unique to Vietnam either. And those markets have slowed down a bit, I guess, to put it somewhat mildly. But what do you also like to see from Vietnam to kind of continue accelerating the solar and wind growth? I mean, I know that's a bit related to the previous question, but maybe specifically for those two.
As I said in the previous question, I think policy's consistency is really important. Like I know that a lot of offshore wind investors are waiting there for the policy to be finalized so that they can actually deploy the projects. So I think that's where policy can actually enable the market, and investors are there and they are very eager to invest in the market. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for Vietnam from that end. I think we talk a little bit about the renewable manufacturing opportunities. I think building local industries is also very important. For example, Vietnam is one of the very few countries in the world having competitive advantages for manufacturing solar PV. So I think building that long-term capacity of Vietnam being able to provide some of the local content for the supply chain, including offshore wind and solar PV, is really important. And I think that's one of the important part that the government also highlight in the resource mobilization plan as well. And I think that's something that it's very important. Like if we got an industry in the country that can actually support the energy transition, the government will therefore try to push policies to actually enable that industry to flourish and to grow. through some of the incentives in the market.
Okay. And when you talk about an industry, obviously that means workers. I know sometimes talking about wind turbines and things like that, it can be easy to just picture machines and things like that. But you need a skilled labor force. Vietnam they're making this really hard push this is beyond energy, but push for, semiconductors and other high tech sectors while try to move away from, older manufacturing forms like garments, I suppose. Vietnam famously is touted for its young, kind of eager workforce. So do you think this need for skilled labor could be a comparative advantage for Vietnam in the transition?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's a report by the ASEAN Center for Energy called ASEAN Energy Outlook #7, highlight that actually there's a high proportion of renewable jobs at the moment are very concentrated in Vietnam after the period of 2020. And they also have a forecast by 2050, there will be around 5.5 million jobs will be created in South Asia, renewable jobs will be created in South Asia. And 50% of that will be in Indonesia and Vietnam. So I think there's a big potential for Vietnam to actually build out the green skill capability and think of ourselves as a regional green skill hub. And that's something that also resonates to foreign investors as well. If they want to invest in renewable projects, they want to invest in even it's not just within the renewable sector. Sometimes in the years to come, investors also will need to think about how they can actually divert their portfolio more to the green projects, for example. So having that green skill competitiveness will actually help Vietnam a lot in attracting foreign investor in the country. And as you say before, Vietnam has a really good fundamental young labor force, family really focused on education. Vietnamese students are always on the top charts of students studying overseas in the US, in Australia as well. So I think there's a big favor for education in Vietnam. And I think Vietnam can actually use that as a comparative advantage to attract foreign investor into the country in the years to come.
Well, Trang, thank you so much for again, a kind of multi-sectoral look. I mean, that's how you have to look at this topic. So Vietnam, of course, some kind of immense challenges in the way of its transition, although what country doesn't have challenges, but also some huge opportunities. So this is a topic I'll certainly continue to watch, and I'll include the reports you mentioned in the show notes. And thank you again for sharing your insight.
Thank you, Michael. My pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to the Vietnam Weekly podcast. Please rate or review the show on your preferred podcast platform, and be sure to share it with friends or colleagues who may be interested. Connect with the Vietnam Weekly on LinkedIn, Threads, or Instagram, and get in touch with any comments at matatarski@gmail.com. See you next week.